Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from 107 affiliated movements around the world. And today on ICMDA webinars, we've got Justin Brierley speaking to us, a subject based on his new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You might be surprised to hear that there is a rebirth. Despite the increasing secularization of the West, Justin Brierley believes we may be seeing a renewed interest in faith, even in our post-Christian culture. So having hosted conversations between Christians and skeptics for over 18 years, Justin will be speaking on why the new atheism has grown old and secular intellectuals are considering Christianity again. Justin is well known to UK listeners. He's a UK broadcaster, writer, and a speaker who seeks to create thoughtful conversations about faith with both Christians and also skeptics. He hosted the Unbelievable show and Ask NT Wright Anything podcast for many years. And he currently hosts the Re-Enchanting podcast and a newly launched documentary series called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And Justin's latest book, also perhaps surprisingly titled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again, published by Tyndale in September 2023. And I had the immense privilege of reading this book earlier this year and was really taken with it and would really heartily recommend that you read the book. But this broadcast today will give you a really good overview of the subject matter, and I hope also will encourage and inspire you. Justin lives in Surrey, England, with his wife Lucy and their 4 children, Noah, Grace, Jeremy, and Toby. Justin, it's just a real pleasure to have you here today on ICMDA webinars, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and to engaging with you later. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Peter, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone who's able to be with us on this webinar today. It's a rather auspicious day here in the UK. It's the day of the general election as well, so I've been out to cast my vote. But wherever you're coming from in the world, I hope you enjoy the conversation. And again, you've heard a wonderful introduction there from Peter. But it's a real pleasure to be here because it's been a fascinating journey over the past year, exploring this, what I call surprising rebirth of belief in God. The book that you can see there is the one that's really behind a lot of the talks and thinking that I'm doing at the moment. It really emerged from a conversation I had several years ago with Douglas Murray. And it was Douglas Murray who suggested that there might be a turning of the tide. Some of you may be familiar. I'll introduce who Douglas Murray is in a moment, but you may be familiar with this stanza of a poem by Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet who wrote Dover Beach. And it's oft quoted to stand in for the way in which secularization has really overtaken the West. And this was written 150 years ago. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar. And in many ways, that has only accelerated 150 years from Matthew Arnold's day, as we see science and technology and secularism become what is effectively a post-Christian age in the West. But as I say, it was a conversation about 3 years ago that I had with Douglas Murray that made me start to question this. Douglas Murray, for those who don't know, is a sort of conservative political commentator. He's the associate editor of the Spectator magazine. And he describes himself sometimes, or described himself to me at least, as a Christian atheist, because any Christian beliefs he had, he sort of lost in his late teens, early 20s. And he fell in with the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris and co. But he came to realize actually that everything he valued about life really stemmed from the Christian heritage that he was the inheritor of. And so he talks about the fact that actually he calls himself a Christian atheist because he really believes actually that Christianity is important, that there's value to Christianity. And that's a view he's come around to increasingly in the last several years. Now, I was having him in conversation with New Testament historian N.T. Wright, and they were having a conversation on a post-Christian age, meaning, purpose, that sort of thing. And one of the comments Douglas made to me during that conversation really stuck out. He said, quoting that well-worn phrase from Matthew Arnold, that the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, he said, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. That's the point of tides, after all. And he went on to talk about the fact that a number of his intellectual peers had surprisingly been converting to Christianity, not in vast numbers, but enough to make him sit up and take notice. And very often, as he put it, drinking from the deepest wells, perhaps converting to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And he wondered whether there might just be something on the horizon, a turning of the tide, if you will. And it was interesting because I'd noticed something similar, a lot of interesting stories of adult conversions to Christianity, quite surprising ones. And I'd also noticed very much a change in the conversation around faith. So I have been hosting conversations on faith for many years. And the talk show, the debate show that I began in 2005, Unbelievable, was very much born in the heyday of the rise of New Atheism. This was, as many of you, I'm sure, will be aware, a very dogmatic, quite dismissive form of atheism that rode high in the bestseller charts, the so-called four horsemen of the New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett there. Two of them no longer with us now. But they had best-selling anti-God books. You may remember the atheist bus campaign in London, bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And it was really, this was the heyday of a kind of very anti-religious mood. It was very cool to be an atheist and to speak out about the dangers of religion and that it was a fairy tale and so on. So this was the atmosphere in which my radio show Unbelievable and eventually podcast and video show got established. And we hosted a lot of those quite punchy dogmatic debates around the new atheism with some of those representatives opposite Christian thinkers. But over time, the conversations began to change. This is a photo from a conversation I had in 2018. And the person on the left is Susan Blackmore, who's quite a well-known atheist psychologist from the UK. And on the right, Jordan Peterson, who's quite a well-known Canadian psychologist. But it was noticing a change in the conversation, especially some secular intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, that really alerted me to the fact that something had changed in the atmosphere when it came to the God conversation. And I'll return to Jordan Peterson and his particular influence later on. But what I've labeled this is the surprising rebirth of belief in God. Now, this isn't a claim that suddenly our pews are being filled to capacity again in the West. Rather, it's the claim that I think the conversation on God has changed quite significantly in the last 5 years or so. I began to notice that the new atheism, in many respects, had really waned. And there's a long story to be told of that. In fact, I tell it really in the first chapter of the book, The Rise and Fall of New Atheism. And not only did it become something of a passing phenomenon, the publishing boom sort of fizzled out eventually, but also it had a sort of internal meltdown as well. And there's an interesting story to be told about that, about the way that once the new atheists had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, they couldn't agree really on anything else. And they had all kinds of splits over what we would now call sort of woke and anti-woke sort of positions on things, to the point where, you know, people like Richard Dawkins were getting stripped of their Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association for his views on transgender. And these, you know, folk were unwilling to share a stage with each other any longer. And very much I saw, as a sort of interested bystander, that the whole movement start to implode in that way. But more than that, more than the internal implosion of new atheism, I also began to see that it really hadn't answered people's existential questions. And what had really opened up with the loss of the Christian story was actually a meaning crisis. People still needed some kind of a story to live their lives by, but just offering them science and reason, as the new atheists hoped would be enough, wasn't enough. And what I think we began to see is people reaching for all kinds of other, often quasi-religious stories in the absence of the Christian story that once sort of gave people a common shared identity and purpose. So I started to put this together into a book, and I wanted to reflect really the ways in which I see the God conversation coming back to the fore in culture today. And the book really deals with a lot of the the interesting secular thinkers who are, again, asking questions about God and asking whether we can live without something like the Christian story in the West. I've sort of divided this talk into three segments, three reasons to believe in God, three reasons why I think God is a better explanation than the atheist story of reality. But I want to sort of tease those out, looking at some of the ways in which some of these interesting secular thinkers are reminding us of the God conversation again in various ways. The first way is actually the way in which I believe God makes sense of human existence, because this, in a sense, was one of the key claims of the New Atheism, that science had effectively got rid of God. But of course, what actually, if you look at the history of science over the last few decades, you'll find that actually a lot of what scientists are discovering about the nature of our universe, the nature of life, is pointing towards rather than away from God. And I was increasingly having conversations on my Unbelievable show with people on both sides of the aisle on these discussions, but increasingly persuaded by the compelling evidence that actually there is, it would appear, a beginning to the universe that needs an explanation beyond the universe, that there is this extraordinary fine-tuning of the universe for life. Again, many of you may be familiar with some of these arguments, but this idea that the universe at its birth was dialed to exactly the right precision when it came to things like the force of gravity and the fundamental constants and so on. And it appears that there had to be some kind of intelligence behind that whole story. But it's not just Christian apologists and scientists making this case. There have been all kinds of interesting people outside the church and outside the faith who have been noting this. One of the people I've really enjoyed hosting for conversations over the years is Paul Davies. He's heads up the Origin Center at the University of Arizona, and he's a popular sort of scientist. He's written a lot of popular level books, and he's certainly, done a lot of research and thinking on areas like Big Bang cosmology, the fine-tuning of the universe for life, and indeed the origins of life as well. And I remember in one of the conversations, he talked about the fact that he didn't have a faith in God per se, but he certainly wasn't a materialist naturalist. And he's one of these people who's been rather a thorn in the side of many of the atheist biologists like Dawkins and co, who led the New Atheist movement, because he refuses to sort of say that there's simply no ultimate purpose or meaning in the universe as they insist upon. In fact, he put it like this to me in one of our conversations, where we'd been discussing not just the fact that the universe produced us, but that it produced conscious creatures able to reflect on their place in the universe. And the fact that we can do science at all is a rather remarkable fact of human beings and their place in the universe. And here's how he put it to me. He said, the directionality in the universe going from matter to life to consciousness. He said, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. I think that's a sort of religious feeling, he said, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. And Paul Davies is far from the only secular scientist noticing this fact of our universe, that it seems to be set up in some way. There's something going on at a deeper level. And I would be actually tempted to reach for a Greek word to describe this, logos, which of course is the word used in John's Gospel to describe the pre-existing word of God, Jesus speaking order into chaos, speaking life. And for me, it's always fascinating when scripture comes together with our best science to suggest that actually there is a kind of logos behind the universe. I go into this in one of the chapters in some depth, but in some recent episodes of my podcast documentary series, you can hear me talking to people like Paul Davies and others about the logos behind life. And so this is just one area where I think there's a fascinating dialogue that has really emerged in the last decade or two, where people are really pushing back on the atheist materialist paradigm, that all that ultimately exists is matter in motion, the laws of physics, and we don't need anything more than that. I think that really is beginning to be severely questioned in academic circles. And it's just one aspect of what I see as a larger picture of this rebirth of belief in God across lots of different spheres. Perhaps one of the most significant spheres, though, where I see this rebirth of belief in God happening is around the question of human value. I well remember having a conversation. My first conversation with Richard Dawkins took place after a debate he'd had with John Lennox at Oxford University. And it was very revealing because Dawkins obviously had presented his atheist case for reality. And our conversation got onto the subject of morality and whether we can, in a sense, live without God in an atheistic universe. And this is exactly how our conversation went. I said to Richard Dawkins, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself? Oh, sorry, I'll go from earlier. Actually, this was how the conversation began. I said, but if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine, where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad. That's a value judgment, glad that we live in such a society. I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say that the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he responded, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, there's nothing about it that makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and you should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist like Richard Dawkins. But the problem is we do recoil at the idea that our belief in morality, the view that rape is wrong, is just the happenstance of the hand that socio-cultural evolutionary forces have dealt us, that actually it could have been another way, and indeed has been seen in other ways, in other cultures, in other times. The problem is we feel actually that that's wrong, don't we? There's a deep sense in which we believe that morality can't simply be subjective in that way, that there really are right and wrong ways to treat other human beings. And for me, at a philosophical level, that points to the fact that there is a moral lawmaker, there is a moral lawgiver in the universe, if we believe that actually there are some things that are really right and wrong. But not just at a philosophical level, but also at a cultural level, there's been all kinds of interesting, again, secular intellectuals pointing out that the morality we inhabit in the West is not a result of atheism or the Enlightenment or science. It comes from the Christian Revolution specifically. And one of the best known people in this respect is Tom Holland. He's a historian. His best-selling book, Dominion, really tells his own story. And he's well known now as a co-host of the Rest is History podcast, very popular podcast around the world. And Tom's story itself is rather interesting because any sort of Christian influence he had sort of waned by his teenage years. He was a happy secular person until he started writing his popular histories of the Greek and Roman world. And he realized how alien their values and lifestyle were to his own. He was quite attracted to the glamour of that age and that era. But this was a world that was unspeakably cruel in many ways, where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. And what he came to realize was that the values he held as a liberal Westerner of equality, dignity, human rights, progress, compassion, they all stemmed not from the Greeks and the Romans or from the Enlightenment or science. They came specifically from the Christian Revolution, this extraordinary movement that started from the claim that the Messiah had been crucified and been given the death of a rebel slave, and that this completely flipped upside down the way people started to think of themselves and completely permeated Western culture eventually. He makes this case over 600 or 700 pages in his book Dominion, but it's been a very persuasive case. Many, many people that I've met have been very persuaded by Tom Holland's case that actually we really owe Western civilization and our, if you like, moral imagination to the Christian story, and asking questions about what happens in the absence of that Christian story ultimately. I think Tom Holland is asking those kinds of questions. And it's not just Tom Holland. Very briefly, I could mention Louise Perry, another really interesting secular thinker, coming to very Christian conclusions in her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, where she really questions what we've actually gained and what we've lost since the 1960s and the liberalization of our attitudes towards sex and relationships. Again, this is another significant thinker, in my view, who, again, from the outside of the church, is asking what we've lost when it comes to the Christian view of sexual morality. I won't, because of time, I won't go into any more detail on that. But again, you can listen to an episode where I speak to Louise about this on the podcast series itself. So there's been a kind of a sea change for me in culture as some of these significant voices with very large platforms actually begin to ask these questions about what we do in the absence of the Christian story. And then finally, I think there's been a kind of existential change in the atmosphere. I do believe that God makes sense of human purpose in a way that an atheist materialist story of reality simply cannot. And some of the key people I've found who have been speaking into this are people like Jordan Peterson. He's a bit of an enigmatic character. He's a bit of a Marmite character. Some people love him, some people hate him, something of a culture warrior in many ways. But nonetheless, when he really came to prominence in 2017, 2018, it was because of these extraordinary popular 2 to 3 hour lectures he was giving on the book of Genesis. And thousands of people were turning out to hear him speak. And these were the kinds of crowds that, any pastor would have loved to have turning up for their lecture, for their sermon on the Bible. But somehow Jordan Peterson had captured these thinking millennials and Gen Z, very often young men, because he was finding that actually there were lots of people asking deep questions about meaning and purpose and identity. People who evidently their questions had not been answered by the Sam Harrises and Richard Dawkins. It was essentially the same crowd who had been turning up for the New Atheists who started to listen to Jordan Peterson. And Peterson himself began to have dialogues with Sam Harris and Dawkins and others during that time. And I hosted him on my own show. And you would have been forgiven for thinking he was the Christian apologist in this debate, because he so earnestly defended the idea that the only way you can make sense of human value is if we are made in the image of God. When I asked him, well, do you believe in God? He said, well, it depends what you mean by God. And it gets a bit difficult to tie down exactly where he is. Although I think he's very much sort of teetering on the edge, let's say, of a commitment to faith. But having said that, many people around him have come to faith recently. His wife, Tammy, has entered the Catholic Church recently. His daughter, Michaela, has become a Christian. Many of his key sort of friends and thinkers are Christian theologians and thinkers. So the net seems to be drawing in on Jordan Peterson. But wherever he stands at a personal level, certainly his influence has been quite marked. I've met so many people who he sort of has opened the door to Christianity intellectually by pointing them back to the wisdom and deep symbolism in the Bible. So he's just one interesting character who is, again, part of this, I would say, surprising rebirth of belief in God. And then more recently, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her story came to light after I'd actually published the book. So she doesn't really get mentioned in the book, but I do cover her story in some depth on the new podcast series, because in many ways, her story really, I felt, confirmed the thesis that I'd published last September, because in November, she came out with a viral article on the Unheard website titled "Why I Am Now a Christian." And just a very brief summary of her life, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was, if you like, part of the New Atheist cadre of speakers. She was, if you like, the fifth horseman of the New Atheism, probably the most famous female atheist in the world. Somali born, came out of a fundamentalist Islamic background and really rejected religion on the back of that. Spent some time in the Netherlands in politics, but eventually kind of joined this sort of, cadre of speakers and thinkers among the New Atheists. But obviously had a real change of heart over the last couple of years. She talks quite movingly, actually, about a sort of emotional, spiritual journey she went on where she became very depressed to the point of suicide, actually. And it was during therapy that she finally sort of opened up about faith to her therapist. And the therapist said, if you could believe in a God, what kind of a God would you believe in? And she said, well, I can't believe in the God I was raised in, with that God was a monster. And this therapist said, well, describe to me the God that you would like to believe in. And she said she started describing that God and found that the God she was describing was Jesus Christ. And so she thought, well, perhaps I need to investigate this story. And so she began attending church. And as I say, she now says that she's a Christian. I think she's still finding her way in that, but it's a very interesting personal journey she's been on. But more than that, I think she, again, has been very persuaded by the Tom Holland thesis that actually the West needs the Judeo-Christian heritage if it's going to survive, and lots of people have criticized her article in Unheard because it did have, a lot of those sort of socio-cultural political overtones. But I think there is a personal journey that's gone alongside it. So just again, another very interesting example of what I would call this surprising rebirth of belief in God, as we see these very unexpected, surprising stories of people coming to faith. I'll just finish off with briefly the story of Molly Worthen as well, who I had the pleasure of interviewing about a year ago, a very recent convert to Christianity. And again, a very unlikely one, because she's a professor of history of religion at the University of North Carolina. And for really all her working life had been a sort of interested agnostic, covering religion, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it in North America. But it was only when doing research and for an interview for The Atlantic magazine with a megachurch pastor, J.D. Greer in North Carolina, that she finally got sort of challenged by him to get off the agnostic fence. He asked her, have you ever really looked into the life and teachings of Jesus Christ at a historical level? And she admitted she really hadn't. And so he gave her some homework, and she went and did it. And he put her in touch with some interesting thinkers like N.T. Wright and at the time Tim Keller before he passed away. So she ended up having these email correspondences with some of these folk. And along the way, as she read and as she thought through it, she realized there was a lot more compelling historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth and this movement he began. And she realized that there was something happened, as she put it, 2,000 years ago. And she got to a point where she felt actually she could believe this, that this made sense, both of her kind of existential questions, but also it made historical and rational sense as well. And so to her own great surprise, in I think it was August 2022, she was baptized in this megachurch. And she was, as she would say, the last person she expected that would happen to. And if it can happen to someone like Molly Worthen, if it can happen to someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think it could happen to a lot more people as well. As I say, my book especially doesn't make the case that this is sort of, we're seeing some great revival in our time exactly. But I do think that we're seeing the furthest ebb of this secular, of the sea of faith. Yes, the sea of faith has gone out a long way, but I do believe we're at the point where the tide is starting to turn. And partly that's because I think people need a better story to live by. They've been trying to live on the fumes, if you like, of the remains of the Christian story in the West. But there are lots of other stories vying for people's attention today. And not all of them are good. A lot of them are very destructive. I think a lot of them are the reason why we're in the midst of these culture wars. But I think people reach a point where actually they're desperate enough to turn back to God. As G.K. Chesterton once said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And we're seeing that happen in terms of a lot of the progressive left ideologies that become the sort of sacred ideology for someone. That becomes their God, or political mythologies on the right become their particular idol. But none of these stories will satisfy ultimately. I think people ultimately will find their way back to the true, beautiful and good story of Christianity. And I think we're starting to see that in some of these secular intellectuals who are pointing people in that direction. My prayer is that the church will be ready to meet these meaning-seeking intellectuals, the people who are perhaps ready to come back and explore faith again. I'm not a good prophet of what may be, but my hope and prayer is that we will see a revival of sorts. It may look different to previous revivals, but I believe we're due for one. And I hope that with me, you'll pray for that to happen. I'd be delighted to answer any questions, but that brings us to the end of this particular part of the talk. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Justin, for that. Really a taster of your book, which goes into a huge amount of depth. And as I said at the beginning, I'd really recommend that people read it. We've got time now for Q&A. So the first one comes from Natasha Wright in Canada, Justin, who's saying, why do you think there are a growing number of intellectuals that recognize the benefits of Christianity? People like Tom Holland, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt. You mentioned also Louise Perry, I think she's another one, but don't seem to have accepted Jesus as a personal savior. And I know there are many people praying for the likes of Jordan Peterson, for example, and to see his wife and daughter coming to faith, and yet he's not quite there, is he? Why?
Well,
why
yes, it's a great question. And in all honesty, I do see a lot of these thinkers on a spectrum, if you like. And I think there are some who are in the sort of happy to sort of view Christianity as a useful fiction, something that's helpful for culture, but they're really not at all persuaded is actually true. And I might put someone like Jonathan Haidt in that category. I think he's absolutely written and spoken about the value of faith, but I don't think he has particularly any intention of actually jumping in to faith in that way. I think there are some people who are teetering on the edge, let's say, people like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, actually, who I think are absolutely persuaded of the value of Christian faith and are also very drawn to the beauty of the story as well, and really would like it to be true. Certainly in my last public conversation with Tom Holland, he was quite candid about his personal spiritual sort of experiences. And I would say, for all intents and purposes, he's a churchgoer, he's a communicant Anglican, I think he believes as much as he possibly can. He says he has waves of doubt, but there are equally times when it all seems to fall in place, and we're certainly said we're all a mixture of faith and doubt, aren't we? I think again, Jordan Peterson, I don't know exactly where he is, but I do know that he's wrestling hard with these questions now. Whether he will eventually sign on the dotted line or whatever, I don't know. But all I can say is, regardless of exactly where they are, whether they're in or out, as it were, they're certainly pointing large parts of their audiences to Christian faith. And I sometimes wonder, in God's providence, whether some of these thinkers are actually, in a sense, have more reach and more ability to reach secular audiences because they're not seen as sort of already, signed up to the Christian faith in some kind of way, as much as I would love for them, obviously, to embrace Christ. And then you've got people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I think genuinely have become Christians. They may be sort of still very much on a journey of learning and understanding everything, but there's obviously people who have embraced that, and so I think it's a spectrum. As I say, I think for some people for whom they can understand the cultural benefits of Christianity, there is a certain amount of humility sometimes that's involved in actually bowing the knee to something that we will never fully come within our intellectual grasp, God and Christ. There's something about that does require a degree of humility. And sometimes I think that is difficult for some of these intellectual thinkers who obviously are so used to sort of having everything entirely nailed down in under their own intellectual control. So that would be my attempt at an answer to why that is, that some people seem to be there or not quite, and so on.
Yeah, and I guess there's a real element of the cost of faith as well, isn't there? Crossing that boundary, in a sense, makes you a target in a different kind of a way. I was fascinated by your 3 points about why people are more engaging with Christianity now. And your second one was God makes sense of human value. And you recounted this fascinating conversation with Dawkins, who is now apparently saying he's a cultural Christian, whatever that means. But you were asking them the difficult question, well, where do moral judgments come from? And if the world is nothing but the product of matter, chance, and time, how do you get an ought? How do you get a moral value from an is? You can't do it. And I've been fascinated by reading some of these folk and seeing how they go back to, and you mentioned this in your talk as well, that the source of human value being rooted in the Judeo-Christian ethic, and specifically the whole idea that human beings are made in the image of God and that are therefore hugely precious. And that's a huge part of Christian ethics as applied to medicine as well. But people like Tom Holland, who you mentioned, other intellectuals, Ben Shapiro is another, coming from an Orthodox Jewish background, Ian Ferguson, who's married to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, historian, and all of them reference Genesis 1:26 and 27, and the idea of being made in the image of God as the source of human value. I'd just be really interested in your perspectives on that, and whether that's come up in your conversations.
It has increasingly, and I think there's a sort of sense in which, as I say, you can take this at a philosophical level, and I think a lot of people have been sort of persuaded at some point by the moral argument that actually we can't make sense of morality or the idea of human rights and human dignity without some kind of moral lawgiver that exists outside of simply time and chance and material and so on. And of course, that was famously what brought C.S. Lewis to theism, was the moral argument, his view that actually there must be a source of truth and beauty and justice and so on. outside of his sort of atheistic worldview. And I do see, a certain number of intellectuals going on that route, but more than that, I do see more of them actually becoming persuaded by the Tom Holland thesis that whatever you think at a philosophical level about objective, morality, you've got this fact that the values we do hold dear in the West, equality, human rights, dignity, compassion, so on, they are very specifically bred from this Christian story, and that it's evident. Just a survey of the rest of the world will tell you that not everyone holds those views. There are other worldviews out there, the Putins and of this world, the Chinas of this world, the fundamentalist Islams of this world, and indeed historically. So I think as Tom Holland has particularly pressed that point, that actually whether we can actually hold on to this view of morality, this view of human flourishing in the absence of the Christian story, I think that's where you've got a lot of these thinkers starting to take that very seriously. Neil Ferguson, as you said, the husband of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, people like Douglas Murray as well. They're all, I think, aware that this is a sort of a rare fruit cultivated in unique soil. And if we cut off the roots, i.e. the Christian story, will we have the fruits going forward? And that, I think, is exercising a lot of these intellectuals. Now, the question is, for me, can you sort of try to just encourage people back to the fruits of Christianity without actually believing the story? And I think that's going to be difficult, because I don't think we got these benefits without people actually believing this, in investing their lives in it. And that's why I think we are seeing this tussle in the hearts of many secular intellectuals who recognize how important Christianity was to the moral foundations of the West, and they're given sort of having to decide, well, can I believe this? Or because ultimately, if you don't believe it, then it is kind of whoever is the most powerful wins in the end. That's it is nature red in tooth and claw. So yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out with many of these secular intellectuals.
It was interesting to hear you describe how people have come, well, not quite to faith, but certainly to or in some cases to faith. If we take the case of Molly Worthen, for example, through their intellectual inquiry. So it was actually through their thinking and study that made them think it was a prospect. And I was fascinated hearing you talk about Tom Holland's early journey and how he looked at Greek and Roman civilization. And there are things to admire, of course, but then, as you mentioned, slavery, sexual exploitation, low views of women and children, and so on, are not things that we have so much in the West now. And Tom Holland was, in his book Dominion, at the end, he talks about the rise of what we call wokery, if you like, the sort of progressive left, if you like, which Douglas Murray writes a lot about as well, and says that with its idea of human rights right at the fundamental basis of it, that it would never have happened if it hadn't been for Christianity. In other words, that kind of culture could have only emerged in a post-Christian society. We don't see it in Greece and Rome and Babylon and those. I just wondered what you thought of that and the way that perhaps we can use it in discussions.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Holland has a lot of interesting things to say here, because he absolutely acknowledges that our beliefs in human rights and the kind of the role of the victim and so on all stem from the way Christianity completely reshaped our view of that, because it was Christ who became a victim for us, if you like, who becomes the chief example of what sacrificial love looks like, and so on. And so that inevitably has shaped our thinking in the West in all kinds of ways. And he likens it to being simply like the water that a goldfish swims in. We no longer sort of really recognize that it's there, but it is. And to that extent, as he said himself, whether people believe in the Christian story or not, at a kind of moral level, they are actually Christians. We're kind of instinctively Christian because that's the way our culture has been shaped. Now, interestingly, in a post-Christian age, that has all kinds of directions in which it can go. And so you may find people kind of using that same kind of sort of appreciation of the victim for their particular political cause, whether some sort of social justice issue or whatever the kind of the quote unquote woke thing is that they may be And for Tom Holland, that is just a kind of another outworking of Christianity, that it's sort of an inevitable sort of outworking, if you like. I think in some respects, he almost thinks that Christianity has almost been too successful, because to some extent, the church, by sort of promoting the importance of equality and dignity and human rights and so on, now is saying nothing different to what society already believes in large part. And therefore, he says, really, the church, it's difficult actually for the church to look distinctive in the way it looked distinctive in the first centuries with its view of when it came with those views. And I think his worry is that the church sort of will just sort of fade into the background. And the way he puts it to me is he wishes that, Christians would keep Christianity weird, essentially, try and not just blend into the culture, state what it is that you actually believe, what's different about what so he wants Christians to major on the supernatural and the ethical claims of Christianity, and not to just sort of blend into the culture in that way. And so in that sense, it's difficult, because the triumph of Christianity, according to Tom Holland, is in some respects the reason why it's also fading from view as well, because it's been too successful. But as I say, I suppose where I differ with Tom Holland in that respect is that I think as we lose the Christian story, we also lose the rationale for believing in these things. And I think that's where we are seeing a lot of these secular intellectuals and their audiences waking up to the fact that there has to be a story to make sense of why we believe in human dignity, equality, and so on. And that there will be sort of people who take it to an extreme. And the problem is that when these social justice issues around LGBT rights or feminism or racial justice or whatever, when they get separated from a Christian story of reality, they become kind of quasi-religious in themselves. And that won't, you can't support those sort of independently of Christianity. And that's the problem. I think that these causes and activist movements often take on all the worst aspects of religion. They're very puritanical. They're very, they're very to cancel people, declare them heretics. But they don't have grace. They don't have an understanding that we're all fallen. And so what you see is kind of the very worst sort of aspects of religion in these new sort of quasi-religions that emerge, because they don't have the underpinnings of the Christian story any longer. And I think, again, that's a reason why I see people moving back towards the Christian story. They realize you can't just have morality without the Christian story. You've got to, it has to be informed by something deeper than just the sort of the things that people take from it in a post-Christian world.
Yeah, fascinating. You've mentioned a couple of surprising conversions. There was Molly Worthen and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Any others that you could point to? People whose contemporary conversions have been genuinely surprising. I know in the UK we've had Russell Brand recently, haven't we? But if you'd like to comment on that, or any others that have been in the public domain.
Yes, Russell Brand was very interesting. I mean, I mentioned him briefly in the book because I would say he's been on something of a spiritual journey for several years now, going from this sort of wild, hedonistic, drug-fueled lifestyle to suddenly engaging a much more kind of spiritual approach, but very much sort of informed by Eastern mysticism a lot of the time, very pluralistic kind of approach. So it was interesting and refreshing to see him, just at the start of this year, start to obviously crystallized very much into Christianity. And I'm not sure, I don't think anyone's really done the interview with him yet, exactly what happened to make him suddenly realize that Christianity was the story that seemed to make sense. And it would appear, him having sort of mentioned some of the people involved in his baptism at Easter, that Bear Grylls has obviously been of some influence in his life, the TV explorer and Christian. But yeah, I'd love to have an interview with him at some point. There are, it should be said, some allegations hanging over Brand that came out obviously at the end of last year, and that's kind of tempered, I think, some of the reaction to him. But I'm personally happy to take his account at face value that he really has encountered Christ in a new way. He's obviously still at the very beginning of that journey, as he says himself. But I'm I take heart that he's obviously finds that this is the story that seems to be making sense for him. And again, a huge audience that he's talking in very open terms about his Christian conversion. So we wait and see what happens on his journey. One of the ones that I talk about in more depth in the book and in the podcast series is Paul Kingsnorth, who's a fascinating individual, a sort of celebrated poet and author in the UK, who sort of had his own sort of atheist period in his sort of late teens, maybe early 20s, but he couldn't shake the idea that there was more to life. And he actually spent a long time as a Buddhist. He completely rejected sort of any Christian influences in his life from an early stage, but he sort of tried Buddhism for a long time. He was always a great lover of nature, though. He was an environmental activist for many years, and he realized that something in him wanted to worship something. So he actually tried worshiping nature. He joined Wicca for a while, worshiping in the woods. But even that, he found a sort of strange pastiche in the end of sort of quasi-pagan Christian heresies, really, he described it as. And he just had this extraordinary experience. So whereas someone like Molly Worthen went on this quite historical intellectual journey, I think Paul Kingsnorth went on quite an experiential journey, actually, in which suddenly people started to talk to him about Christianity. People who were in his sort of fans of his, who were readers, started to reach out to him, who turned out to be Christians. His wife, quite out of the blue one day, not a Christian herself, but said, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "Don't be ridiculous. What are you talking about?" sort of thing. But then he started having dreams about Jesus, very vivid dreams about Jesus. And he, as he puts it, he got dragged kicking and screaming out of Wicca and into Christianity. And the stream of Christianity that he has embraced is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And it has completely changed his life. He says it's, and he was, again, himself surprised that this was where he found himself. But he found that what he had thought was Christianity turned out not to be Christianity. He thought he'd basically dismissed a caricature of Christianity. And what he discovered when he actually started to investigate it, to read some of the great church fathers and theologians, was something deep, rich, and that really made sense of his whole story. And so he's become a very absolutely strong advocate, evangelist, I would say, from his own corner of Christian faith. And I'm very glad for stories like his. And again, I find it fascinating when I see it feels at least like increasing numbers of these adult converts. There are many more I could list, some public, some not so public, who have suddenly been finding that actually they've somehow given themselves intellectual permission in the last 5 or 6 years to take Christianity seriously and to embrace it.
Sam Maldonado was asking, do you think the church should have more intellectual preaching? It appears that many churches emphasize dogma and blind belief rather than reason. Is this pushing intellectual searchers out of the church?
I think there is a danger of that. Often this depends on which church network you're in, and it's not by no means the case that all churches sort of preach very sort of fideistic, dogmatic, sort of sermons. I know many churches that are a great mixture, the right mixture of heart and head and everything else. But yes, probably generally there are many people who have dismissed Christianity because they think it's not for them. They're a sort of person of science or reason or intellect, and they've been given the impression that that is not what Christianity is about. So I would love to see more opportunity for people to hear a rational defense of Christian faith. Having said that, one of the key things I say towards the end of the book is that while I welcome the move back towards an intellectual defense of Christianity in apologetics, and I think in many ways the New Atheists helped the church to kind of pick up its theology and apologetics books again. At the same time, we need to recognize that people don't simply convert on the basis of arguments and logic. You have to appeal to their imagination as well. And that's what C.S. Lewis did so well. And it's every one of these secular intellectuals who I've seen cross the line to faith, it's been both an intellectual and an imaginative journey for them. They've really wanted it to be true. Something has made them wish that Christianity were true at an imaginative level. And then very often it's been very helpful that they've had the intellectual, if you like, backing for that as well. But I think very often that the imagination comes first. We have to make people wish that it were true and then show them that it is true. And for me, that's an important thing for us not to forget in the church.
There's another question here, anonymous question, saying people who feel the emptiness of atheism, materialist naturalism, are often led to higher things including the existence of God, by emotions, adversity, life events, aesthetic experiences, music, literature, and so on, things that science can't catch the essence of, but although by no means less real. And he's asking, is there any hope for science encouraging people to believe in God as a result of its progress and findings rather than as a result of its shortcomings? And I think you hinted at in the first of your answers as to why people were engaging more, that the Christian faith really did make sense of things like the Big Bang, the complexity of the material and biological universe, and so on.
That's right.
Is it a both and, or
I think it is a both and, because I've met lots of people for whom actually science has been a wonderful gateway to faith. The problem is, of course, that the narrative that's been spun by the New Atheists and many others for many years is this idea of a conflict between science and faith. And actually, it couldn't be less true. I mean, the scientific revolution was absolutely a Christian scientific revolution. All the early pioneers were believers. And it was precisely because they believed in a God of order who had invested the cosmos with order that they went out and did their science, expecting to find the same. So there's all of the myths that need busting in that sense. But even once you get beyond that, you find that actually, I think year by year, the pointers towards God from science continue to grow. Now, I'm not saying that science is can simply be used as some sort of proof for God. But I do think that the more we understand about the universe and our place in it, the more it opens up rather than closes down the God question. And I do see movement in that direction. I think there's the brash science has killed God approach of the New Atheists is waning. I'm far more likely to meet people who are taking a far more considered approach to the fact that the universe seems to be invested with some kind of purpose and consciousness. Now, this isn't leading everyone to the God conclusion, but you are seeing fascinating aspects of it in the rise of, for instance, in academic circles, far more openness to teleology, for instance, in biology, the so-called third way in evolutionary biology, that is starting to see that actually there's some kind of purpose at work in life. It's not just blind forces, if you like, or in the area of consciousness. There's been a real move away from a sort of deterministic, purely material approach to consciousness. So far more people now are embracing concepts like panpsychism that suggest that consciousness is somehow fundamental in the universe. Now, again, they're not embracing Christian theism at that point, but they're certainly moving away from naturalist atheism at that point. And I think that we can welcome that, because it's in a sense a move in the right direction. I just think they haven't got all the way there. So I think, I do think things are happening that we can be encouraged by in that sense. And I often think it's just a case that, like anything, science goes through pendulum swings, and it's swung a long way over to the sort of materialist view in the last in the last century, essentially. And we may be seeing it swing back again at some level. So I would say there's definitely scope for people approaching the God question through science in today's age.
Yeah, brilliant. Justin, sadly, we've run out of time. We could go on, and there are more questions that we won't get to, but thanks so much on behalf of all our listeners for coming and speaking to us today and engaging with us, and to all of you for joining us today on ICMDA webinars. Thanks again, Justin, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. May the Lord bless you.